While Rome built its Colosseum, another empire was carving monuments into granite mountains thousands of miles to the south. While Caesar crossed the Rubicon, an African king commanded armies that made the ancient world take notice. This empire traded with Rome, minted its own gold coins, and sheltered the early followers of Islam. And yet, most of the world has never heard its name. This is the story of Aksum, the kingdom that Rome acknowledged, the empire that history buried, and the civilization that is finally being reclaimed. Before we go any further, if history like this deserves to be told, if the erased chapters of the ancient world matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because the story you are about to hear has been left out of textbooks, ignored by mainstream history, and dismissed by those who refused to believe that an African civilization could stand equal to Rome. But the stones still stand, and today we let them speak. It is the 1st century of the Common Era. The Roman Empire stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia. Its legions march on engineered roads. Its senate debates the fate of millions. Across the known world, scholars name the great powers: Rome in the west, the Parthian Empire in the east, the Han dynasty in the far reaches of Asia. But there is another name, one that appears in Roman texts, Persian records, and Indian merchant accounts. A kingdom sitting at the crossroads of Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean. A kingdom called Aksum. The ancient Persian religious text known as the Arda Viraz Namag listed the 4 greatest kingdoms of the known world: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. Not Egypt, not Carthage, not any other African state. Aksum, a civilization so powerful, so strategically positioned, and so wealthy that even its rivals acknowledged its greatness. The roots of Aksum reach back deep into African soil. The region that would become the Aksumite Empire had already seen earlier complex societies. The pre-Aksumite kingdom of Dumpt, which flourished around the 10th to 5th centuries BCE in the northern Ethiopian highlands and present-day Eritrea, laid early cultural and agricultural foundations. Dumpt had connections to the ancient kingdom of Saba in southern Arabia, and its people spoke a Semitic language that would evolve into Ge'ez, the classical language of Aksum. By the 1st century CE, Aksum had emerged as a fully formed state. Its capital city, also called Aksum, sat in the highlands of what is today the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. The geography was not accidental. The highlands offered fertile land, reliable rainfall in a continent where water was power, and crucially, proximity to the Red Sea port of Adulis, the gateway through which Aksum would build its empire. The Aksumite city itself was remarkable. It held royal palaces, temples, and, most strikingly, the enormous carved stone pillars known as stelae, towering obelisks that announced to the world, here stands a civilization of permanence. Aksum did not build its empire through trade alone. It built it through force, disciplined, organized, and relentless military force. The Aksumite army was a formidable institution. It combined infantry with cavalry, and its most feared element was the war elephant. Elephants were not simply symbols of power. They were weapons of psychological and physical destruction on the ancient battlefield. Aksum had access to the African forest elephant through its highland territories, giving it a military asset that few kingdoms in the ancient world could match. The most documented of all Aksumite military commanders was King Ezana, who ruled in the 4th century CE. Ezana left behind something extraordinary: stone inscriptions recording his own military campaigns in his own words. These inscriptions, written in Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaean, describe his armies marching into multiple territories, defeating enemies, and bringing rebellious peoples to submission. His most significant military achievement was the destruction of Meroe, the capital of the ancient Kushite kingdom, also known as the Kingdom of Kush, located in present-day Sudan. Kush had been a major African power for over 1,000 years. Its pyramids still stand in the Sudanese desert today. But around 350 CE, Ezana's armies marched north, crushed the Kushite military, and burned Meroe to the ground. One African empire had consumed another. In his own inscription, Ezana described how his forces killed and captured thousands, seized cattle and prisoners, and destroyed the enemy's ability to resist. This was not conquest for spectacle, it was strategic domination. With Kush eliminated, Aksum controlled the Nile corridor and the highland approaches to northeastern Africa. The empire had expanded its reach to a scale that no other contemporary African state could challenge. Power in the ancient world had two pillars: military strength and economic dominance. Aksum had both. The port of Edulis on the Red Sea coast was one of the busiest commercial harbors in the ancient world. Through it flowed goods from 3 continents. From the African interior came ivory, the most prized luxury material of the ancient world, along with gold, frankincense, myrrh, obsidian, live animals, including rhinoceroses and giraffes for Roman spectacles, and enslaved people. In return, Aksum received cotton cloth from India, silk from China, glassware from Rome, and olive oil from the Mediterranean. A 1st century CE Greek merchant manual called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea documented this trade network in remarkable detail. It described Edulis as a major port, noted the goods available there, and recorded the political authority of the Aksumite king over the surrounding region. This document confirms that Aksum was not isolated, it was integrated into the global economy of its time. But the most definitive marker of Aksumite economic power was its currency. Aksum was one of only 3 kingdoms in the ancient world, alongside Rome and Persia, whose monarchs minted their own gold coins. This was not a minor distinction. Gold coinage required a stable economy, centralized authority, access to gold resources, and the kind of international trade relationships that made such coins accepted across borders. Aksumite gold coins have been found in archaeological sites stretching from Egypt to India. Even more striking, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine II, writing in the 4th century CE, addressed the Aksumite king as an equal, a peer in diplomatic correspondence. Rome did not address just anyone as an equal. That Aksum received such recognition speaks to how seriously the ancient world took this African empire. In the 4th century CE, something happened in Aksum that would permanently alter the course of African and world history. King Ezana converted to Christianity and declared it the official religion of the Aksumite state. The story behind this conversion is documented and historically significant. 2 young men from Tyre, Frumentius and Odysseus, were traveling with a merchant along the Red Sea when their ship was attacked. Most aboard were killed. The 2 survivors were brought to the Aksumite court, where they eventually rose to positions of influence. Frumentius, in particular, became a trusted figure and began spreading Christian teachings within the court.
When Ezana came to age and assumed the throne, he had already been exposed to Christian ideas through Frumentius. He embraced the faith, and around 330 CE, roughly the same time that the Roman Emperor Constantine was Christianizing the Roman Empire, Aksum made Christianity its state religion. The Aksumite coins from this period show the shift. Earlier coins bore symbols of the moon and sun. After conversion, they bore the Christian cross. Frumentius was later consecrated as the first bishop of Axum by Athanasius of Alexandria and is revered in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today as Abba Salama, Father of Peace. The church that took root in Axum was not a colonial import. It was an indigenous institution that developed its own theology, its own liturgy in the Ge'ez language, its own monastic traditions, and its own sacred texts. The translation of the Bible into Ge'ez, called the Garima Gospels, produced what are believed to be among the oldest surviving Christian manuscripts in the world, dated to between the 4th and 7th century CE. Among the most powerful traditions associated with Aksumite Christianity is the belief that the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum holds the original Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest described in the Hebrew Bible as containing the tablets of Moses. Whether one accepts this as history or tradition, the fact remains that this belief has shaped Ethiopian identity for over 16 centuries. Of all the physical legacies Axum left behind, none are more awe-inspiring than the stelae, the towering carved obelisks that still stand in the ancient city today. These were not simple stone pillars, they were intricately carved from single pieces of granite, fashioned to resemble multi-storied buildings with false windows and doors carved into their surfaces. The largest still standing is the King Ezana stele, approximately 24 meters tall, but it is believed that the Great Stele of Axum, now fallen and broken, was once 33 meters high, which would have made it the largest such structure in the ancient world, taller than the obelisks of Egypt, taller than anything Rome raised on a single stone. How they were quarried, transported, and raised without modern engineering remains a subject of serious scholarly inquiry. The granite came from quarries outside the city. Some of the fallen stelae weigh hundreds of tons. The precision of their carving and the logistics of their erection speak to a society with advanced organizational capacity and engineering knowledge. One of these obelisks did not remain in Axum. In 1937, Italian forces under Benito Mussolini looted the second largest stele, standing 24 meters tall and weighing 160 tons, and transported it to Rome, where it was re-erected near the Circus Maximus as a trophy of conquest. It stood there for nearly 70 years. Only in 2008, after decades of diplomatic pressure from Ethiopia, was the obelisk finally returned and reinstalled in Axum. The relationship between Axum and the emerging religion of Islam is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated chapters in world history. In 615 CE, just 5 years after the Prophet Muhammad began preaching in Mecca, a group of his early followers faced intense persecution from the powerful Quraysh tribe. Facing violence and suppression, Muhammad instructed some of his companions to seek refuge across the Red Sea in the Christian kingdom of Aksum. He reportedly told them that its king was a just ruler under whom no one was wronged. This event is known in Islamic history as the first hijrah, the first migration. The Aksumite king at the time, referred to in Islamic sources as the Negus and identified by many scholars as Ashama ibn Abjar, received the Muslim refugees. When the Quraysh sent envoys to the Aksumite court demanding the refugees be returned, the Negus listened to both sides, heard recitations from the Quran, and reportedly wept at the similarity between the Quranic description of Jesus and the Christian understanding of him. He refused to hand over the refugees. He protected them. This act of protection is remembered in Islamic tradition as an act of extraordinary justice. The Prophet Muhammad is reported in various hadith to have spoken highly of the Aksumites and to have forbidden his followers from waging war against Abyssinia, saying, "Leave the Abyssinians in peace as long as they do not take the offensive." The historical irony is profound. Aksum sheltered the early Muslim community at its most vulnerable moment. That same faith, as it spread and empowered new Arabian maritime powers, would eventually cut off the Red Sea trade routes that sustained the Oxavite economy. Aksum was not merely a passive observer of the ancient world. It was an active military and diplomatic player whose interventions shaped events far beyond the African continent. In the early 6th century CE, the Arabian kingdom of Himyar, in present-day Yemen, was ruled by a king named Yusuf Asar Yathar, known in Christian and Byzantine sources as Du-Nuwas. Du-Nuwas had converted to Judaism and around 523 CE launched a violent persecution of the Christian population of Najran, a city in his kingdom. Byzantine sources and Ethiopian inscriptions record a massacre of Christians, with estimates of thousands killed. The Byzantine Emperor Justin I appealed to the Aksumite king Caleb, also known as Ella Asbeha, to intervene. Caleb responded. He assembled a naval force, crossed the Red Sea, invaded Himyar, defeated and killed Du-Nuwas, and installed a Christian ruler over Yemen. For a period, Aksum controlled territory on both sides of the Red Sea, an achievement that made it the dominant power of the Western Indian Ocean world. This campaign drew in multiple great powers, Byzantium, Persia, Arabia, in a contest that historians now recognize as a foreshadowing of the geopolitical struggles that would reshape the region when Islam emerged just decades later. Aksum was not merely a passive observer, it was an active military and diplomatic actor. No empire lasts forever, and the forces that brought Aksum down were multiple, overlapping, and centuries in the making. The rise of Islam in the 7th century fundamentally altered the commercial geography of the ancient world. As Arab traders and the new Islamic caliphates came to dominate Red Sea commerce, Aksum's centrality to that network diminished. The port of Adulis, once thriving, declined. Trade revenues fell. The economic engine that had powered Aksumite expansion began to stall.
Environmental historians have pointed to another factor: deforestation and soil degradation around the Aksumite heartland. Centuries of agriculture, construction, and fuel use had stripped the highlands of trees. Without forest cover, the soil eroded. Agricultural productivity fell. A population that had grown wealthy began to struggle to feed itself. Internal fragmentation followed. The political unity that strong Aksumite kings had maintained began to crack as peripheral regions asserted autonomy. The royal capital itself was eventually moved south, away from the ancient city, suggesting that the original center had become difficult to defend or sustain. Then there is the figure of Queen Yodit, also called Gudit, a semi-legendary ruler whose historicity is debated among scholars, but whose impact on Aksumite tradition is deeply embedded in Ethiopian memory. According to Ethiopian chronicles, sometime around the 10th century CE, Yodit led a devastating military campaign that overthrew the reigning Aksumite dynasty, killed members of the royal family, and burned churches and monuments. Whether this represents a historical individual or a composite memory of dynastic collapse, the tradition records something real: the final shattering of the Aksumite state. By the 10th century CE, Aksum, as an imperial power, had ceased to exist. The city remained sacred, but no longer commanded empires. The obelisks stood over a world that had moved on. Aksum did not simply fade from history, it was pushed out. When European scholars and explorers encountered the ruins of Aksum in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many refused to accept that indigenous Africans had built what they saw.
The stelae were attributed to outsiders, to Phoenicians, to ancient South Arabians, to anyone other than the ancestors of the Ethiopian people who had lived alongside these monuments for centuries. The same pattern of denial that had been applied to Great Zimbabwe, to the Egyptian pyramids, to structures across sub-Saharan Africa, was applied to Aksum. This was not merely academic ignorance, it was ideological. European colonialism required a narrative in which Africa had no history of its own, no self-generated civilization, no indigenous complexity. That narrative was constructed and maintained deliberately, shaping school curricula, encyclopedias, and public understanding across the Western world for generations. Ethiopia was never formally colonized. It defeated the Italian colonial invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, the only African nation to successfully repel a European colonial army in the scramble for Africa. But its history was still colonized intellectually. Its civilization was still minimized, misattributed, and ignored in the global conversation about the ancient world. Today, modern archaeology, guided heavily by Ethiopian scholars and international teams working with Ethiopian institutions, is systematically reclaiming what was lost. Excavations at Aksum and surrounding sites continue to produce evidence that expands and refines understanding of this civilization. The story is not finished, it is being rewritten. The legacy of Aksum is not contained in ruins, it lives. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which traces its direct lineage to the Aksumite conversion of the 4th century, is today one of the oldest continuous Christian institutions on earth, with tens of millions of adherents. Its liturgy is still partly conducted in Ge'ez, the classical language of Aksum. Its traditions, its sacred texts, its monastic culture, all rooted in that ancient empire.
The victory at Adwa in 1896, when Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II defeated the Italian army, was consciously connected to the Aksumite heritage. Ethiopian identity, shaped by centuries of continuity with Aksum, provided the psychological and cultural foundation for a people who refused to surrender to colonial power. Aksum also echoes in the global African diaspora. Rastafarianism, which emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, looked to Ethiopia, and specifically to the line of kings claiming descent from the Aksumite tradition, as the source of spiritual and cultural liberation. The language of Zion, the reverence for African kingship, the resistance to colonial erasure, all of it reaches back, in one form or another, to the world Aksum built. In 1980, the ruins of Aksum were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing their outstanding universal value. The ancient city joins a list of global landmarks that include the pyramids of Giza, the Colosseum of Rome, and the Great Wall of China. Aksum stands among the monuments of humanity, not despite being African, but because of what Africa built. This was Aksum, a civilization that rose from the Ethiopian highlands and made the ancient world acknowledge its power. An empire that traded with Rome and Byzantium as an equal. A kingdom whose king minted gold coins, commanded war elephants, and crossed the Red Sea to reshape the politics of Arabia. A nation that sheltered the first Muslims when they had nowhere else to turn. A culture that raised stone monuments that still defy easy explanation, and a history that was buried, not by time, but by those who found it inconvenient. The stones of Aksum were never erased, they were simply waiting for the world to look again. If this story reached you, if it made you question what you were taught about the ancient world, about Africa, about the civilizations that shaped human history, then share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it, because history does not belong to those who write the textbooks. It belongs to those who refuse to let it be forgotten.
Subscribe for more hidden chapters of history that were never meant to be found. The truth does not disappear. It waits, and now it speaks.